Camping wasn't something I would normally choose. As a high school English teacher in her early 30s, my idea of relaxation leaned more toward curling up with a novel or enjoying a quiet cup of coffee on my balcony. But Hannah, my closest friend since freshman year of college, had insisted that a weekend in the Blue Ridge Mountains would do wonders for my stress. She'd framed it as an opportunity to disconnect from grading papers, emails, and the ever-present ding of notifications. Reluctantly, I agreed. The drive up was breathtaking. Early autumn had draped the mountains in fiery reds and golds, and the narrow roads were lined with wildflowers swaying gently in the crisp breeze. Hannah was in her element, humming along to a playlist she'd curated just for the trip. By the time we found the perfect clearing to pitch our tent, even I was starting to see the charm of the outdoors. The spot she'd chosen was idyllic, a secluded meadow encircled by towering pines with a bubbling brook nearby. The air carried the faint, sweet scent of moss and damp earth, a sensory reminder of how far we were from the chaos of the city. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a modest fire and settled in for the evening. Marshmallows on sticks sizzled over the flames, and we swapped stories, Hannah recounting her latest hiking adventures while I shared amusing anecdotes about my most dramatic students. By the time the fire burned down to embers, the stars were spilling across the inky sky like scattered diamonds. A deep silence fell over the forest, broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek. It was the kind of stillness that makes you feel small in the best possible way. We finally crawled into our sleeping bags, clumsily fumbling around the tent in the dark, and drifted off to the soothing sounds of the wilderness. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when something jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the trees, but as I focused, I realized the sound had a strange cadence, high-pitched, intermittent bursts. It sounded almost like laughter. Soft, distant, childlike laughter. My pulse quickened as I whispered into the dark, "Hannah, do you hear that?" She stirred beside me, her voice groggy. "Hear what?" "Laughter," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It sounds like kids." Hannah sat up, rubbing her eyes, and listened intently. The sound came again, faint and drifting, like it was carried on the wind from far off in the trees. "It's probably other campers," she murmured, though there was a note of unease in her voice. "Go back to sleep." I tried to follow her advice, but something about the laughter felt wrong. It wasn't just that it was out of place, it was the way it carried, disjointed and unnatural, as though it didn't quite belong here. I finally managed to doze off again, but when I woke the second time, the sound had grown louder. It wasn't far off anymore. It was close. Too close. Hannah was already awake, clutching a flashlight. Her face was pale in the dim glow of the beam. "This isn't normal," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's 2 a.m. Who would be out here laughing like that?" The eerie giggles came again, now mingled with faint whispers. Hannah and I exchanged a tense glance before she unzipped the tent and pointed the flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense foliage, but nothing moved. "Hello?" Hannah called out, her voice firm but wary. It echoed into the night. No one responded. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The oppressive silence that followed made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We sat frozen in the tent, straining our ears for any hint of movement outside. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, Hannah sighed and zipped the tent back up. "It's just the wind," she muttered, though her tone betrayed doubt. Neither of us really believed that explanation, and neither of us expected to sleep. For a while, the night was quiet, save for the wind rustling the trees. But then, just as my eyelids began to grow heavy, the laughter returned. This time, it was different. It wasn't distant or faint anymore. It was right outside the tent. The sound was higher pitched now, giggles barely muffled, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was trying to suppress them. My heart pounded as Hannah tightened her grip on the flashlight. "Whoever this is, it's not funny," she yelled, unzipping the tent and shining the light into the clearing. The beam swept across the campsite, revealing nothing but trees and empty ground. No children. No shadows. No movement. "This doesn't make sense," Hannah muttered, stepping out of the tent. "Are you insane?" I hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her back inside. We don't know what's out there. She hesitated, then reluctantly zipped the tent shut. We sat in tense silence, gripping the flashlight and a camping knife Hannah had brought just in case. The giggling stopped again, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves. They circled the tent, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was watching us. If this is a prank, it's the most elaborate one I've ever seen, Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of my shallow breathing. The noises continued through the night, soft laughter, hushed whispers, and even, at one point, the faint creak of what sounded like a swing. We sat back to back, too terrified to peek outside again. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, the noises ceased. The relief we felt was short-lived. As we stepped out of the tent, we were met with an unsettling sight. In the dirt just outside our campsite was a strange spiral formation made of sticks, rocks, and leaves. It was too precise to be random, each piece meticulously placed to form a pattern that grew tighter toward the center. "What the hell is this?" Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, a lump forming in my throat. "I didn't do it," I managed to say. Neither of us could explain it. We hurriedly packed up the tent, our hands shaking as we stuffed our gear into our backpacks. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made us jump. Just as we were about to leave, Hannah stopped, her gaze fixed on a tree near the edge of the clearing. There, tied to a low-hanging branch, was a small bundle swaying in the breeze. It was a crude doll, fashioned from knotted fabric and stuffed with grass. Its face was painted with 2 uneven black dots for eyes and a slanted line for a mouth, a crooked, menacing smile. Hannah grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to go. Now." I didn't argue. As we hurried to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Once inside, with the doors locked, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure dart between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. The drive back to town was silent, the eerie events of the night playing on a loop in my mind. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened in those woods. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never set foot there again. Some places are meant to be left alone. As the faint light of dawn finally broke through the trees, Lisa and I felt a fleeting sense of relief. The strange noises that had plagued us throughout the night had ceased, and the forest was eerily silent. Exhausted and on edge, we crawled out of the tent, expecting the morning sun to wash away the dread of the previous hours. But the moment we stepped outside, that fragile sense of peace evaporated. In the middle of our campsite, where the ground had been bare the night before, lay a carefully arranged pattern. Sticks, leaves, and stones had been placed with unsettling precision to form a large spiral that wound tighter and tighter toward the center. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just random debris scattered by the wind, but the symmetry of the design made that impossible. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, had made this. Lisa stood frozen beside me, her eyes locked on the strange formation. "Did you do this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, my throat dry. "No. Why would I?" "Please tell me this is some kind of prank," Lisa whispered, a tremor creeping into her voice. "We're the only ones out here," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. The laughter from the night before replayed in my mind, as though the forest had been mocking us, warning us. Neither of us spoke as we began packing up the tent. Our movements were hurried, clumsy. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. It felt as though the trees were watching us, their shadows stretching unnaturally in the early morning light. Just as we were stuffing the last of our gear into the car, Lisa grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Look," she said, pointing toward the tree line. I followed her gaze, squinting into the dense forest. At first, I saw nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed it, a small bundle swaying gently from a low-hanging branch. It was wrapped in tattered strips of fabric, its makeshift form bobbing softly in the breeze. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting with unease. The bundle was a crudely made doll, its head fashioned from knotted cloth and its body stuffed with what appeared to be dried grass. 2 uneven black dots had been painted for eyes, and a slanted line formed its mouth, a crooked, unsettling smile that seemed almost mocking. Lisa's voice wavered as she tugged at my sleeve. We need to go. Now. For once, I didn't argue. We hurried into the car, locking the doors as soon as we were inside. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life after what felt like an eternity. As Lisa backed the car down the gravel path, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. The drive back to Asheville was tense and silent. Lisa gripped the steering wheel like it was her lifeline, her knuckles white against the leather. I stared out the window, my eyes scanning the road and the dark woods beyond it. Even in the daylight, the forest felt menacing, its shadows deeper than they should have been. When we finally reached Lisa's apartment, neither of us moved to get out of the car. The silence between us hung heavy, filled with the weight of everything we couldn't explain. Finally, Lisa broke it. "What do you think that was?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I shook my head, still staring out the windshield. "I don't know." But it wasn't just kids playing. We sat there for a while longer, neither of us willing to say what we were both thinking, that the forest hadn't wanted us there. It felt like it belonged to something else, something that had left the spiral and the doll as a warning. Or an invitation. I haven't been camping since that night. Lisa and I talk about it occasionally, but only in nervous, joking tones, never for too long. It's easier to leave it in the past, to pretend it was just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I know the truth. The forest is supposed to be a place of peace, a refuge from the chaos of everyday life. But that night, it felt like something entirely different, something ancient and unsettling, a place that didn't welcome us and never would. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long, stretched shadows over the trail. I had been hiking solo all day, and while I welcomed the quiet, I couldn't shake the faint sense of unease that had settled in my chest. Earlier, I had passed another hiker, or rather, he had passed me. He was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face, and his stride had an unsettling rhythm, too smooth, almost mechanical, like someone rehearsing their movements. I had called out a friendly greeting, but he didn't acknowledge me, didn't even glance my way. At the time, I convinced myself he must have been wearing headphones or lost in thought, but as the hours passed, the memory of his silent, unwavering pace continued to gnaw at me. By the time the sun sank behind the canyon walls, I was ready to settle down for the night. I found a small clearing that offered a breathtaking view of the stars, pitched my tent, and gathered some firewood. I decided to set up my camera for a time-lapse shot of the night sky, something I'd been looking forward to capturing. As I adjusted the tripod, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the dim light, but when I turned, I froze. The same figure from earlier stood on the trail about 100 yards away. He was completely still, facing directly toward me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice carrying through the stillness. No response. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't even flinch. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for him to say something or continue on his way. But he remained rooted to the spot, an unmoving silhouette against the fading light. Eventually, I decided to ignore him. If he wanted to keep his distance, so be it. I returned to my fire, eating dinner as the flames crackled and danced. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing just beyond the circle of light. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, unease had burrowed deep into my mind, eroding any sense of comfort I might have felt. This was supposed to be my escape, a few days of solitude and peace. Instead, I felt more vulnerable than ever. I told myself it was just nerves, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But no amount of rationalizing could prepare me for what came next. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the sharp sound of snapping branches. My eyes flew open, and I lay completely still, my ears straining to identify the noise. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, the crunch of leaves or the faint rustle of underbrush. But as the moments passed, the sounds grew louder, closer, more deliberate. It was the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps circling my campsite. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling as I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, shining the beam into the darkness. The trees loomed large and menacing, their shadows distorted by the flashlight's beam. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaky and unsure. The snapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on me. My breath hung in the air as I stood frozen, waiting for any kind of response. But none came. I retreated into the tent, leaving the flashlight within reach. My heart thundered in my chest as I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. Animals don't move with such calculated intent. They don't circle campsites, stopping just outside the tent's reach. As I lay there, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, the sounds returned. This time, the footsteps were softer, slower, as though whoever, or whatever, was out there was trying to mask their presence. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I unzipped the tent once more and stepped outside. The air was bitterly cold, and the silence was deafening. I swung the beam of light in a wide arc, scanning the perimeter of the clearing. For a moment, the light caught movement, a shadow darting between the trees. My throat tightened as I forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" This time, the response came, but it wasn't words. It was a low, guttural growl, deep and primal, reverberating through the stillness and freezing me in place. I stumbled backward, my mind racing through every possible option. Should I stay put and hope they left? Or should I run and risk being followed? My body felt paralyzed with fear, but somehow, I managed to back into the tent and zip it shut. For the rest of the night, I sat curled in the corner, clutching the flashlight and listening to the faint sounds of movement outside, snapping branches, rustling leaves, and, occasionally, the soft crunch of footsteps. I barely breathed, terrified that even the slightest noise might provoke whatever was out there. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my legs weak and unsteady. The clearing was eerily quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw them, footprints scattered around the campsite, large and unmistakably human, but barefoot. They circled the tent, weaving through the clearing like a silent predator stalking its prey. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree, was torn open and empty, its contents strewn across the ground. My hands shook as I packed up my gear, my mind racing with questions and scenarios. Who, or what, had been out there? Why had they circled my tent all night? The hike back to the parking lot was a blur, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sending waves of panic through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I was being followed. But the trail remained empty, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of my hurried footsteps. When I finally reached the parking lot, I threw my gear into the car and locked the doors, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I sped away, the tension in my chest began to ease, but the questions lingered. Looking back, I can't say for certain what I encountered that night. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone with an unnerving lack of social skills and a dark sense of humor. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that defied explanation. The wilderness is vast and beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. Out there, beyond the reach of civilization, the rules change. It's not the bears or mountain lions that haunt me most, it's the thought of another person, or something pretending to be one, watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of the light. The forest was vibrant with the hum of insects and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Evelyn was in her element, smiling as she unpacked our gear with an infectious enthusiasm that momentarily eased my own reservations. "This is going to be perfect," she said brightly, spreading out a picnic blanket near the edge of our chosen spot. "Just us, nature, and no distractions." I nodded in agreement, though a small part of me couldn't shake an odd sense of quiet unease. The campsite was completely isolated. No signs of other campers, no distant laughter, no glow of fires through the trees. At the time, it seemed like the ideal escape. As the evening fell, we cooked hot dogs over the crackling fire, sharing stories and admiring the stars that glittered through the gaps in the towering pines. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost otherworldly. But as we prepared to head into the tent for the night, the serenity cracked. A faint snap echoed through the trees, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking. I stopped mid-step, my ears straining. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Evelyn shrugged without much concern. Probably just an animal, she replied, adding with a grin, we are in their home, after all. Her logic made sense, and I forced a laugh to brush off the growing tension creeping up my spine. Still, as we crawled into the tent and Evelyn quickly drifted off to sleep, I lay awake for a while, listening to the soft babble of the nearby stream, willing myself to believe that the forest was as safe as it seemed. The next morning, as we sipped coffee by the rekindled fire, something odd caught my attention. Just beyond our campsite, faint footprints marred the soft dirt, leading toward the stream before disappearing completely. I frowned, pointing them out to Evelyn. What do you think? Are these ours? She squinted at the tracks, her expression tightening. No, she said after a moment. Mine are smaller, and yours are wider. These don't look like ours. Her words gnawed at me, but I didn't want to let it ruin our trip. I reasoned that perhaps someone had wandered through earlier in the week. Evelyn seemed willing to accept this explanation, and we spent the day exploring a nearby trail. The forest canopy provided a soothing shade from the summer heat, and Evelyn busied herself taking pictures of wildflowers while I filmed clips for a short video project I'd been planning. When we returned to the campsite that evening, everything seemed untouched, the earlier footprints nearly forgotten. We spent the night roasting corn over the fire, laughing about a funny story Evelyn's coworker had told her. But just as I was starting to feel fully relaxed, it happened again. Another snap, this time louder, closer, and impossible to ignore. Evelyn froze, her eyes darting toward the trees. What was that? She whispered. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the surrounding woods. The light illuminated nothing but still trees and tangled underbrush, yet the hair on my arm stood on end. Probably an animal, I said, though my voice wavered. Evelyn nodded, though her gaze lingered on the darkness beyond the firelight. Let's just get some sleep, she murmured, but her tone betrayed her unease. That night, I kept the flashlight within arm's reach as we lay in the tent. Sleep didn't come easily, and every rustle or distant sound set my nerves on edge. Morning brought some relief, but also a fresh wave of fear. As we packed up to explore another trail, I noticed something that stopped me cold, more footprints, fresh and distinct. Evelyn, I called, my voice tense. She joined me, her face paling as she steadied the tracks. These weren't here yesterday, she said, her voice barely audible. No, I agreed, dread pooling in my stomach. And these definitely weren't made by an animal. The tracks led toward the stream again, but abruptly stopped as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had turned back. Our plans to hike were abandoned. Instead, we decided to stay close to camp, keeping a wary eye on our surroundings. As the day wore on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Evelyn jumped at every sudden noise, and I found myself constantly scanning the woods, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond our view. What had once felt like a calm, inviting forest now felt oppressive. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier, the entire landscape charged with an inexplicable tension. By late afternoon, we decided it was time to leave. As we hurried to pack our gear, Evelyn suddenly froze, her gaze fixed on something through the trees. What is that? She whispered. Following her line of sight, I spotted it too, a structure partially hidden by dense foliage. I don't know, I said. Let's check it out. We approached cautiously, stepping over roots and brambles, every sound amplified in the tense quiet. The structure turned out to be a makeshift shelter, cobbled together with branches, leaves, and an old tarp. Inside were discarded food wrappers, an empty water bottle, and a chilling discovery, a pair of binoculars, positioned as though whoever had been there had been watching us. Evelyn's breath hitched. They've been watching us, she whispered, her voice trembling. A cold wave of realization washed over me. The shelter had a clear line of sight to our campsite, almost as if it had been deliberately set up for surveillance. My chest tightened as I scanned the surrounding woods, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows at any moment. We're leaving, I said firmly, grabbing Evelyn's hand. She didn't argue. We rushed back to the campsite, throwing our gear into our packs as quickly as possible. The sun was beginning to set, the long shadows stretching across the forest floor adding an extra layer of urgency to our departure. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing as we started down the trail toward the car. The further we walked, the more convinced I became that we were being followed. Evelyn must have felt it too. Her eyes darted nervously toward every shadow, her grip on my hand tightening with every step. As the car finally came into view, relief surged through me. We threw our gear into the trunk and climbed inside, locking the doors before either of us dared to breathe. The drive back to the city was silent, the weight of what we had just experienced pressing down on us. Neither of us spoke until we were safely back on the highway. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "What do you think they wanted?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted one. Looking back, I still can't fully explain what happened in that forest. Was it a harmless camper with a penchant for voyeurism? Or something darker, more sinister? Whatever the truth, the experience left an indelible mark. The forest, once a place of peace and wonder, now feels like a realm of hidden dangers and unanswered questions. Evelyn and I haven't been camping since. The feeling of being followed gnawed at me, an ever-present weight that made my heart race with every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. Evelyn whispered beside me, her voice barely audible, "Did you hear that?" I strained to listen, trying to separate the faint sounds of the forest from the pounding of my pulse, but all I could hear was the crunch of our hurried footsteps. The oppressive silence was unnerving, amplifying every noise that broke through it. Without another word, we picked up our pace, the straps of our packs digging into our shoulders as we broke into a jog. The trail seemed endless, stretching on far longer than it had felt on the way in, the shadows creeping closer with every passing second. When the car finally came into view, the sight was like a beacon of salvation in the encroaching darkness. Relief flooded through me as we rushed toward it, fumbling with the keys before throwing our gear into the trunk and climbing inside. Evelyn's trembling hands locked the doors as soon as we were seated. "Let's just go," she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't need any convincing. The tires kicked up gravel as I floored it, putting as much distance as possible between us and the forest. The unease clung to us like a shadow, even as the headlights illuminated the main road ahead. The drive back was quiet, both of us too consumed by our thoughts to speak. My mind replayed every unsettling detail, the shelter, the binoculars, the footprints. How long had we been watched? What might have happened if we hadn't left when we did? The questions churned in my head, unanswered and relentless. Even after we returned to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, as if the forest had imprinted its lingering presence on me. Months later, the memory still lingers. The experience has left a mark on me, changing the way I see the wilderness. I once thought of camping as a carefree adventure, a chance to reconnect with nature. Now, I approach it with caution. Every sound, every shadow, feels like a potential threat. The forest, vast and beautiful as it may be, hides its own dangers, some natural, others far more sinister. I've learned to trust my instincts and keep my guard up because, as I've come to understand, the scariest things in the wild aren't always the predators you expect. The sound of footsteps circling our tents had been unnerving enough, but when I heard the distinct, deliberate tug of a zipper, my heart stopped. My chest tightened with panic as I realized the sound wasn't coming from my tent, it was Alex's. Summoning every ounce of courage, I yelled out, my voice breaking through the eerie stillness. "Hey! Who's out there?" The noise stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft babble of the creek nearby. Then, as if startled, whoever, or whatever, it was bolted, their hurried footsteps disappearing into the woods. "Guys, get up!" I shouted, fumbling for my flashlight. Ryan and Alex scrambled out of their tents, their faces pale and flashlights shaking in their hands. Alex's eyes darted frantically around the clearing, his voice cracking as he asked, "What the hell is going on? Why is my tent open?" I pointed toward his tent, the zipper still partially undone. "Someone was out here," I said, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Alex stared at the opening, his expression shifting from confusion to sheer terror. "Oh my God," he whispered, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. "They were trying to get in while I was asleep." The gravity of what had just happened hit all of us at once. The thought that someone had been mere inches from Alex, silently unzipping his tent, sent a wave of nausea and dread through me. Ryan, ever the practical one, broke the silence. "We need to check the campsite," he said firmly. The three of us huddled together, our flashlights sweeping through the shadows as we scanned the darkened woods. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches felt amplified, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. At one point, my flashlight caught a flicker of movement near the edge of the clearing. "Did you see that?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan shook his head, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "Stay together," he warned. "We don't know how many of them there are." Alex couldn't stop muttering under his breath, his eyes fixed on his tent. "They were right there," he kept saying, as though trying to make sense of it all. We spent the rest of the night clustered around the dying embers of the campfire, too afraid to retreat to our tents. The shadows around us seemed to grow darker, pressing in from all sides, and every sound made us jump. None of us slept. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were physically and emotionally drained. In the daylight, the campsite looked deceptively normal, but the evidence of the night's events was impossible to ignore. Alex's tent zipper was still partially open, exactly as we'd seen it hours earlier. Nearby, we found a few of our belongings missing, a flashlight, some snacks, and a water bottle. Small, almost insignificant items, but their absence felt like a violation. The fact that someone had been bold enough to take them while we were right there made my stomach churn. As we were packing up to leave, Ryan pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "Look," he said, his voice low. We turned to see a dirty, crumpled baseball cap lying in the grass. It didn't belong to any of us. Alex picked it up gingerly, holding it between two fingers like it was contaminated. "This wasn't here yesterday," he said, his voice trembling. "It has to be theirs." The realization sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Whoever had been stalking us hadn't just been lurking in the shadows, they'd left a trace of their presence, a reminder of how close they'd been. "What do we do now?" I muttered, the question hanging in the air. Ryan's voice was firm as he answered. "We pack up and leave. Now. I'm not sticking around to see if they come back." None of us argued. We worked in tense silence, throwing our gear together as quickly as possible. Every noise in the woods made us freeze, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. When we finally made it to the car, the tension broke just enough for me to take a deep breath. The doors were locked the moment we climbed in, and as I started the engine, I felt a sliver of relief. We were finally leaving. The drive away from the campsite was eerily quiet, none of us daring to speak. It wasn't until we were miles down the road, safely back on the highway, that Alex finally broke the silence. "I don't think I can do this again," he said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. I didn't blame him. That night had changed everything. Camping had always felt like an adventure, an escape from the chaos of daily life. Now, it felt like a gamble, a risk I wasn't sure I was willing to take again. The thought of someone standing outside our tents, silently unzipping them while we slept, is a kind of fear that doesn't just fade. It lingers, creeping into your thoughts when you least expect it. These days, I'm far more cautious about where I camp and who I interact with in the wilderness. Out there, where there are no walls or locked doors to protect you, it's not always the animals or the elements you need to fear. Sometimes, it's the people, or whatever else is out there, that you meet along the way.